Kenney with the New York DEC. We'll be presenting on changes in Hudson River fisheries over time, and we're going to get his PowerPoint going here. There it is.
All right, thank you. Come on in, have a seat, everybody.
Okay.
There's plenty of room there. All right, so before I get started, I just really want to thank the chapter officers and former officers and the committee members and everyone who's worked to really get this meeting together today. It's been 3 long years since we've had this meeting, and I think everybody who made it happen today really deserves a round of applause. I can't tell. All right, good. So thank you for having me. I've been coming to these meetings for a long time. Started in 2007, and you know, every year I feel like the poster presentations and the breakout talks get better and better each year. Like the quality has improved tremendously since 2007. The same had been true for the plenary talks. I hope I can keep us going in the right direction. Okay. So we'll get right into it. So we're going to do fisheries now and then. If we want to talk about fisheries now and then, we have to talk about our DEC Cornell fisheries team up in New Paltz. Our team is there to manage and monitor the fisheries of the Hudson River, fish and fisheries of the Hudson River, as well as to do research to support that monitoring and management. I'm going to go through some now and then things. The people without names, you'll see them later, and they're really the ones that are doing the work, conceiving the ideas, doing the work of the now stuff that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Okay, so Katrina reached out to me to ask if I would be willing to do this talk about Hudson River now and then. And it seemed like the biggest thing I was bringing to the table was I've been around a long time, which, you know, most days I'm still feeling pretty young, but I definitely was not that day. So I did start in 2000, so that is a little bit of perspective, but I felt like we needed a little bit more. So for each of these 6 topics we're going to go through, I'm going to talk about the 2000s, when I started, the 1980s, because there were some key points in there, recent stuff, and then some arbitrary time from long ago if it made the story better. All right, so we're going to start with monitoring. So monitoring our fish annually is hugely important for us to even be able to tell any now and then stories. We need to know what's going on out there to be able to say anything about the fish populations. So back in the 30s, the whole state got the biological survey done, including the Hudson, and that gave us information about presence and absence of fish in the Hudson River, but it wasn't done repeatedly, and it doesn't tell us anything about trends and how things changed over time. So as we move to the 1980s, we have 2 different kind of surveys begin. DEC started surveys, as well as the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Program began in the 1980s. This was a survey that was a permit condition of the industrial water users on the Hudson River. And so both of these surveys looked at young of year fish abundance annually. The HRBMP did ichthyoplankton and a fall shoal survey as well. And our DEC surveys sample spawning stock in the springtime. And these surveys continued into the 2000s. So we have a very long time series at this point of the DEC surveys and the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Program. Unfortunately, the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Program stopped in 2021 with the closure of Indian Point Power Plant. Fortunately, we do have funding to continue that survey, the most important parts of that survey, for at least 5 years, and to come up with a plan of how we're going to continue to monitor these fish, with an eye towards engaging more people into using this data and being able to address new questions like climate change. Historically, we've used these data mostly for fishing regulations, recreational and commercial fishing regulation rules, we use the data to make the case for the different things we're proposing. With this long time series, hopefully we can get new questions answered. And we're fortunate that the old stuff, all the old HRBMP data, now sits here with Yang Chen's group at Stony Brook, and we continue to work with them to try to figure out how we can collect new data that fits in with this old data that was collected. All right, next is striped bass. Back in the 1980s, oh no, sorry, there's striped bass. They get big, they're anadromous, they spawn up in the Hudson. People love to fish for them, and there's some great examples of fish that were caught in our Holstein survey. And this kind of is the story of coast-wide striped bass spawning stock biomass over time. You can see that back in the 80s, they were very low. And Jim kind of mentioned some changes at the federal level that gave the commission the ability to require states, I was going to say nudge, but it's really require states to implement management changes. And that started happening in the 80s. And you can see that the spawning stock, recovered, and we got up, sorry, I shouldn't explain. We want the spawning stock to be at that dash line. We're worried if the spawning stock is at that red line. So if we come below that red line, we need to take management actions to get back up to the dash line. So, with those changes, in the 80s, the spawning stock of coast-wide striped bass really recovered. And the 2000s were really the heyday of striped bass harvest. In 2010, 6 million fish were harvested coast-wide on the Atlantic coast. More recently, we've seen a decline. The spawning stock biomass went below the threshold in 2013. We began more restrictive management measures. We implemented minimum size limits and then also maximum size limits. And then if you start, having fewer fish that you can keep, you end up letting more go, and then you end up with increased catch and release mortality. So we tried to address that too by requiring the use of circle hooks when you use bait with striped bass. And more recently, it seems like things are heading in the right direction. So hopefully that trend continues. So that's the coast-wide story. And here is a more Hudson River specific talking point on striped bass. So back when we started doing, well, first let me say what this is. This is the survey that Jess Beck and our group runs. We capture striped bass and American shad and a Holstein, and this, what you're looking at here is the size distribution of the male in blue and female in red fish. And so we have a nice dimorphism there. And when we started making regulation changes, our current regulation was that it was just a minimum size limit of 18 inches. So we had a good blend of male and female fish being harvested in the Hudson River. The coast-wide requirement that started coming down the pike in 13-14 was that coast-wide, all the fish that were allowed to be kept would be 28 inches or greater. So in the Hudson River, this did not make a lot of sense if we wanted to increase our female spawning stock biomass. So using this data, Jess was able to make the case that we should really be doing this instead. And in the Hudson, we were able to use conservation equivalency at the commission to have this be the Hudson River's rule, where we focus our harvest on the male fish instead of the female fish. Okay, next topic. What do these two guys have in common? True, but that's not a good Hudson River. Anybody? Where's American shad. They both fish for American shad. And some people think American shad saved the day at Valley Forge, although it's in dispute apparently. So American shad, also anadromous. There's a nice male specimen. They get quite a bit bigger than that. They come back to spawn after 5 to 7 years. They were a huge commercial fishery in the late 1800s especially. There's Grant's tomb in the back. You can also see the stakes behind this boat. They would string up their nets on those stakes. And they also kept our ECOs busy. They would mark, apparently, with these old barrels where the shad were spawning, and that's the area where you weren't allowed to run your gill nets to catch American shad in the Hudson. Here are shad landings over time in the Hudson River, back to the late 1800s. You can see landings were huge in the late 1800s. They were big again around World War II, but a little fewer than in the late 1800s. And then we had another peak in the 80s, which was smaller still. This is what I'm supposed to mention. One of the first jobs I had in the 2000s was to go out with the commercial fishermen on the Hudson River and monitor their catch. And it was I'm really glad that was part of my career, especially now that the fishery is closed. It was really interesting to see those guys at work. But we collapsed the stock and closed all commercial and recreational fishing in the Hudson River in 2010. Since then, there have also been catch caps implemented in the ocean on a few different fisheries that limit the number of shad that can be caught as bycatch. And we've learned from the West Coast that it can take 2 to 3 generations for shad stocks to recover once they've been fished down to levels this low. So that can be 15 to 20 years before we would expect to see a rebound. We've recently, and this is too small to see the details of it, but just to give you the gist, we were hoping before this meeting to announce that the American Shad Recovery Plan was out and available and final, but it's not quite. But it is very close. So hopefully very soon you will see the final American Shad Recovery Plan where we specify what levels we want to see American shad metrics be before we start reopening fisheries. So we've developed metrics around spawning stock biomass, mortality, and recruitment, where if we see the shad at those levels, that's when we'll begin to reopen fisheries. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about staff diversity. In the 1980s, the DEC hired Kathy Hatala, who went on to work in the Hudson River Fisheries Unit for 30 plus years and was one of the loudest advocates for the fish of the Hudson that have ever existed. At that time, Kathy was one of very few female biologists at the DEC. Fortunately, you're going to hear from another one, Kim McCowan, shortly. But there were very few female biologists at the DEC at the time. And by the time I started in the 2000s, not much had changed, at least in the New Paltz office. But after I started, things did slowly get better with regard to gender diversity of biologists at the DEC. I think our unit now has more women than men. I think that's probably true for the marine resources as a whole. But when we come to other types of diversity, we still have some work to do. Jim mentioned, and I think I mentioned also, the ASMFC, the interstate group that makes important decisions about commercial and recreational fisheries up and down the coast, affecting the livelihoods of thousands of people. They take an annual picture each year. So just to give a sense of the diversity of people making the most important fisheries decisions, here's the annual picture. Not a lot of diversity there. A lot of beards. Fortunately, there are things we can do to change this. The parent organization, AFS, has a wonderful program, the Hutton Junior Fishery Biology Program. It's a summer internship for high school students. They get paid. They can come work at your office to learn about fisheries. And the idea is to inspire the next more diverse generation of fisheries professionals. Our intern from this year is down on the bottom left there, holding a big sturgeon, and Azalea is featured on the AFS webpage right now. So I would strongly urge all of you to consider taking on one of these interns. It costs you nothing. They get paid by AFS. If that's not practical for you, you can also make a donation to AFS. And even better, you can earmark it for this program, so they use it for something useful and not their professional certification program. All right, next topic, technology changes with kind of Atlantic sturgeon as the case study. So just briefly, Atlantic sturgeon, they get huge like this, long-lived. Females don't come back for 15 to 20 years. Their eggs are the finest caviar. They spawn in the Hudson River. They were harvested heavily late in the 1800s. The fisheries continued until through the 80s and early 2000s. I'm actually not sure when they closed, but they are now threatened or endangered in all of the East Coast Great Rivers. And, sorry, that's just a little background on Atlantic sturgeon. So now back to the technology changes thing. Back in the 80s, we knew little about how juvenile fish, juvenile Atlantic sturgeon, were using the Hudson. They knew how to catch the big ones that had the caviar, but the movements of the juveniles were not well known. So these two guys used Carlin tags. I don't know how many of you used Carlin tags, but they put out over 4,300 tags over 4 years, which must have been miserable, and learned a lot about the seasonal movements and spawning and overwintering areas of juvenile Atlantic sturgeon in the Hudson River. They also learned they were able to make a population estimate of juvenile sturgeon in the river. Unfortunately, it was a little bit of a wide estimate. It ranged from 12,000 to 144,000. But with this technology at the time, probably not too bad. Moving to the 2000s, we get fancier equipment now. Advances in remote tagging allow us to learn things that we've never been able to learn before. Back in 2000, whatever this was, 2005, that tag on the left was cutting edge. It was a 5-year tag, and it was huge. They've come a long way since. Satellite tag on the right collects a lot of data about the fish's movements and location, and they pop to the surface and then send the data back by satellite. So using that technology at the time, we were able to identify important coastal aggregation areas, identify the unique movements of a few individual fish, and understand the water depths of the fish we're using. And the paper on the bottom there, hopefully soon, we'll have out there that we also use this data to identify specific habitats in the Hudson, not only where they were spawning, but nearby sand wave habitats where they're resting between spawning events. The technology continues to get better. Advances in underwater imaging have let us do even more exciting things. Amanda Higgs and her band of misfits here have done some really great work with Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon. So this underwater imaging allows us to capture images of fish on the bottom of the river. And you can even get a measurement on them, which makes great fodder for a National Geographic story about the mysteries of beneath. But it also allows them to come up with better population estimates, marrying that underwater imaging with sonic tagging to come up with population estimates that require handling far fewer fish than the 4,300 they did with Carlin tags. Amanda is going to talk about this in more detail, or something related to it, tomorrow, one of the talks. Okay, final topic, invasive species. To really think about invasive species in the Hudson, we have to go back to 1825, when the Erie Canal was completed. This was the first link of the interior waters of the U.S. with the Atlantic coast, using the break in the mountains that the Mohawk made, and it was a huge commercial success. The cost of moving a ton of goods from New York City, from Buffalo to New York City, went from $100 to $10. They paid back all the loans for it within a decade, and maybe more importantly today, it was really seen as a kind of symbol of American and New Yorker ingenuity that people don't want to see any changes to because of that, how it's important to people, even 200 years later. So in addition to being great for navigation, it was great for navigation for commercial products and fish and invasive species. And it fundamentally changed the way that the waters in New York State work. So if you look at Rome there, all the water west of Rome used to flow to the Great Lakes. To the east of Rome, it would flow to the Hudson River. And if you were a fish on one side or the other, it would be really hard for you to get from one watershed to the next. You certainly couldn't just swim there. But now with the canal moving through Rome, you can swim from one watershed to the other. Champlain Canal was added shortly thereafter, and now fish can swim from the Great Lakes to the Hudson River to the Champlain watershed with relative ease. So that's troubling for invasive species. So in the 80s, moving more recently, zebra mussels arrived from the Great Lakes. This is what it looks like when zebra mussels invade somewhere. They have no impacts on phytoplankton, zooplankton, vegetation, water chemistry, zoobenthos, and infrastructure. Less than 10 years later, they moved from the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. As we move to the 2000s, I think the important thing with respect to this is we learned more about past movements that likely happened through the canals, through the work of a lot of people, but including Dave Strayer, Ellen Marsden, John Waldman, and Tom Lake. We suspect that white perch and alewives moved from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain. At least 10 fish moved from the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, plus 4 snails and 11 bivalves. And more recently, the spiny water flea swam through the canal to Lake Champlain, which caused folks like Meg Moodley at the Lake Champlain Basin Program to start really exploring what actions we would have to take to prevent these movements through the canal. Today, invasive species continue to move through the canal. So just last year, or I guess 2 years ago now, gobies arrived in the Hudson River, moving through the Erie Canal from Oneida Lake. Kelsey and Scott George are going to talk more about aspects of this later today. And Rich is on our crew and is working closely with Suresh and others to understand what impacts this may have and how far this invasion might extend. Are they going to stay just in the Hudson, or will they extend to the coastal waters of New York? I think Kelsey's going to have clear answers for that tomorrow, or later today. So this is a problem that continues to happen. It's been happening since 1825. And the Lake Champlain Basin Program has done the work that shows the only way to really prevent this is to install a barrier near the watershed divide. Restore the watershed divide to how it used to be, with the hydrologic separation of the watersheds, so that fish can't simply swim between the watersheds. And if the gobies aren't bad enough, the next one's going to be worse. These are silver carp. This is what happens when you drive a boat by them. They make boating practically impossible. They're on the verge of entering the Great Lakes. We're trying to keep them out with flashing lights and sirens and maybe a little electricity right now. But 3 of them have already made it past the flashing lights. The eDNA has already been found in multiple places in Lake Michigan. eDNA has already been found last year in Lake Erie, silver carp. So in my opinion, it's really just a matter of time before these things end up in the Great Lakes. And we need to think about how we're going to keep them out of the Hudson River. Okay, so just to wrap up, as I reflected on this, when it was too late to make any changes, I thought, man, you didn't say anything about PCBs, which is kind of the Hudson River fish story. But I guess, I think how we prioritize our work is focusing on things that we can really do to help manage the species right now or in the short term, which I don't know, might be short-sighted. But that's how, I need simple and concrete things to focus on for us to move the needle forward. And these 6 things were the things that struck me as things you might find the most interesting. So thanks for your time.